Good afternoon, y'all, on this Monday afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this start of our reading of George Jackson's Blood in My Eye. This does happen to be my favorite theoretical contribution of all time, so I'm super excited to start this with y'all. So we are starting from the beginning today, and I don't think I posted a PDF yet, so I'll make sure for the YouTube channel to get that into the description once we're wrapped up here today. If anybody in the chat needs a PDF, let me know, and I'll grab one for you real quick. Ain't no issue. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started on the preface for George Jackson's Blood in My Eye. To the black communist youth, to their fathers, we will now criticize the unjust with the weapon. My dear only surviving son, I went to the Mount Vernon August 7th, 1971 to visit the gravesite of my heart, your keeper's murder and cold disregard for life. His grave was supposed to be behind your grandfather's and grandmother's, but I couldn't find it. There was no marker, just mowed grass, the story of our past. I sent the keeper a blank check for a headstone and 2 extra sites. Blood in my eye. Preface. In his introduction to George Jackson's Soul Dad brother, Gene Jennett wrote, "Nothing has been willed, written, or composed for the sake of a book. It is both a weapon of liberation and a poem of love." Thank you, Sudawoodle, for posting that PDF. I appreciate that. Nothing has been willed, written, or composed for the sake of a book. It is both a weapon of liberation and a poem of love. This book, too, is a weapon, but one entirely willed and purposeful. It was completed barely a week before the author's murder in San Quentin on August 21st, 1971. Let me see this real quick. So the book is a weapon, but when it was completed barely a week before the author's murder in San Quentin. Oh wow. So that opening from George's mother must have been only about 2 weeks before his death. That's crazy. Okay. So it was sent out of the Adjustment Center with specific instructions for its publication, almost as if the author knew that he would never live to see its appearance in print. Describing it a few days before the end, George said, quote, "I'm not a writer, but all of it's me. The way I want it, the way I see it." What he saw and what he wanted, the central passion of his life, was war. The revolutionary war of the people against their oppressors. A war which grew out of perfect love and perfect hate. "I've been in rebellion all my life," he wrote in one of his letters. For a young black growing up in the ghetto, the first rebellion is always crime. Yeah. George's first experience with American law came at 14 when he was arrested in Chicago for stealing a purse. From then on, his life was a constant succession of arrests, juvenile homes, paroles, and more arrests. At age 18, he was convicted of stealing $70 from a gas station. His lawyer promised that he would make a deal with the DA if George confessed to second-degree robbery. He told George it was his only chance because he had a record. Don't put the court to the expense of a trial and they would give you county time. Instead, he was given an indeterminate sentence, 1 year to life. The first time I was put in prison, it was just like dying. Just to exist at all costs for some very heavy psychic adjustment. Being captured was the first of my fears. It may have been an acquired characteristic built up over centuries of black bondage. The turning point in his life came when I met Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, and Mao, and they redeemed me. For the first 4 years, I studied nothing but economics and military ideas. I met the Black Gorillas, George Big Jake Lewis and James Carr, W.C. Nolan, Bill Christmas, Tony Gibson, and many others. We attempted to transform the black criminal mentality into a black revolutionary mentality. He wasn't alone in his discovery. At the same time, other prisoners were just beginning to discover Marx, Fanon, and Mao, who provided them with a new way of regarding themselves in their struggle, a new standard of moral judgment. I have been in rebellion all my life. I just didn't know it. That was a quote. The social insights of Marx and others made it possible for them to have a sense of themselves as members of the human community, members of a revolutionary brotherhood. In prison, commitment to a revolution has a special meaning and a special price. To be identified as a revolutionary by the prison authorities means an almost permanent denial of parole, separation from the other prisoners, solitary confinement, usually in maximum security wings of the prison, transfers from one prison to another, beatings, bad food. It brings down on you the entire punitive and repressive force of a completely totalitarian system. It's crazy. Inside, prison practiced a very special kind of devotion and love. When convicts talk about him, they often use the term for real. Many inmates murder mouth and self-wolf tickets. They do a lot of heavy talking. But when it comes down to the point of action, they disappear. George, however, was as good as his word. Whenever he made a statement of some kind, it would be followed by action. If you were the victim of a racial attack inside prison, there was a good chance that he would turn up fighting for you at your side. Most of his offenses inside prison, the reasons why he was forced to spend over 7 years in various forms of solitary confinement, including the infamous strip cells in Soledad's O-Wing, the reasons why he was never paroled, involved his defense of other inmates. What made him particularly dangerous to the prison authorities was this enormous talent as an organizer. We have got to be together. We have got to be in a position to tell the pig that if he doesn't serve the food when it's warm and pass out the scarring powder on time, everybody on their tier is going to throw something at him. Then things will change and life will be easier. You don't get that kind of unity when you're fighting with each other. I'm always telling the brothers that some of those whites are willing to work with us against the pigs. All they got to do is stop talking honky. When the racists start fighting, all you have is one maniac group against another. That's just what the pigs want. That's from an unpublished interview. It is not coincidental that the need for unity among revolutionary groups is one of the major themes of this book. Try to remember how you felt at the most depressing moment of your life. The moment of your deepest dejection. That is how I feel all the time. No matter what level my consciousness may be, asleep, awake, in between, the thing is there and it keeps me moving. Pins my eye to the ball, uptight, 24 hours a day. Give me a second, y'all. Okay, so thank you for joining us. We're on we're in the preface at the moment, and we are on page 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th page of the preface if you want to join us. Alright, so no matter what level my consciousness may be, asleep, awake, in between, the thing is there, and it keeps me moving, pins my eye to the ball, uptight, 24 hours a day. That's also from an unpublished interview. Locked down inside his cell, George devoted himself to study. His painfully acquired scholarship in the fields of Marxian economics and history rivaled that of most college professors. But sometimes, for days on end, reality itself would vanish from his cell. I would be sitting in a special locked isolation cell. sometimes even with the lock welded shut, and there would be no one to talk to, just the sound of screaming voices. And because there is no human contact, you depend on books. No contact with people. Special lock welded on the door. Nobody around. I'm strictly by myself. The only friend I had was a book. Sometimes I find myself talking out loud to the author. I'd sort of wake myself up and I'd hear myself talking to this other person. I guess it was like some kind of wish fulfillment. When I'm asleep at night, I still find myself talking to those guys. That's also an excerpt from an unpublished interview. Typing laboriously on a plastic typewriter, George published position papers which dealt with prison life and revolutionary politics from a Marxian point of view. He paid a heavy price for his activities. When the prisons couldn't break him through solitary confinement, they attempted to have him killed by other inmates. They were forced to frame me and set me up for the final kill. The word was out among white convicts. Get Jackson. It will do you some good. Once he remarked that there had been 20 setups on his life inside prison. It got so that when he left his cell, he was always ready to parry an attack. But nothing could mitigate the pain of confinement. And the years stretched out and a whole decade passed. In the context of his life, what happened next had a grim inevitability. On January 13, 1970, a new exercise yard was opened in the maximum security wing of Soledad Prison. 8 whites and 7 blacks were skin searched and sent out into the yard. Predictably, a fight broke out between the whites and the blacks. Without any warning, a tower guard who had a reputation as a crack shot began to fire. He shot 4 times and 3 black inmates were killed. 1 white prisoner was wounded in the groin by a shot that ricocheted. Black survivors claimed that one of the wounded men bled to death on the concrete floor. 3 days later, the Monterey County grand jury found that the killings were justifiable homicide. The more things change, the more they stay the same, huh? Less than half an hour after this verdict was announced on the prison radio, a white guard, not the guard who had fired the shots, was found beaten to death. All the convicts in the wing where the killing took place were put into isolation. On February 28th, Fleta Drumgo, John Clichette, and George Jackson were formally charged with the murder. The prison's authorities accused George because, in their words, he was the only one who could have done it. With their total power over the inmate population, the power of parole, solitary confinement, the power of life and death, they were certain they could get the kind of testimony they needed when the trial came. When George's parents came to visit him, they used to bring his younger brother Jonathan. If you haven't read this book before, reading about Jonathan Jackson and the way he lived his life as young as he was is a damn treat. You'll see what I mean. George and Jonathan would get off to one side of the visiting room and whisper together. What went on between them can be seen in this book in the excerpt from Jonathan's correspondence. At the age of 16, Jonathan had an extraordinary insight into the nature of guerrilla warfare. In some of his letters, George was later to refer to Jonathan as his alter ego. After George was accused of the murder of the guard on the 16th of January, Jonathan began to get his first taste of American justice. Jonathan himself wrote, quote, "People have said that I am obsessed with my brother's case and the movement in general. A person that was close to me once said that my life was too wrapped up in my brother's case and that I wasn't cheerful enough for him. It's true I don't laugh very much anymore. I have but one question to ask you, all you people and people that think like you. What would you do if it was your brother?" Close quote. On August 7th, 1971, Jonathan Jackson entered a courtroom in San Rafael, California, and attempted to free 3 black convicts, one of whom was on trial for assaulting a guard. He armed the convicts and took 5 hostages, including the assistant district attorney and the judge, still dressed in his robes. He died a few minutes later in a hail of bullets inside a rented van that was being used for the getaway. "We're taking over," he said. At 17, Jonathan had already come to the conclusion that the only way he could affirm his sense of justice was at the point of a gun. His experience of life in America had convinced him that the only way he could be heard was by an act of suicidal daring. Quote, "You could take our pictures, We are the revolutionaries, close quote. With these words, he announced to the world that he was not a criminal because he no longer recognized the legitimacy of white law. When his sister heard the news of his death, she cried out, but he was only a boy. Her mother corrected her, quote, "Don't say that. He was a man. They killed his father a long time ago." Jonathan wasn't going to let that happen to him. He was going to live like a man. After his death, George wrote in a letter, I haven't shed one tear. I'm too proud for that. A beautiful, beautiful man-child with a submachine gun. He knew how to be with people. I loved Jonathan, but his death only sharpens my fighting spirit. I'm proud just to have known that he was flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood. Close quote. In a news conference 3 days after he said, I love that boy, I was the first to stand him up in his crib. Not a crib, really. All we had was a box. I taught him how to walk. I wanted to teach him how to fly. I'll think of him now as I think of Che Guevara. George Jackson's last book, Blood in My Eye, speaks with the voice of the dead. Not only the dead George Jackson and his brother Jonathan, but the living dead in all of the jails and ghettos of this country. It speaks with the voices of the men who have already given themselves up for dead, or who have nothing left to give except the death for the people. It is very much a book by a man who considered himself doomed. In the last letters, George wrote about the judicial process as the end game. He had foreseen and foretold his assassination at San Quentin 1,000 times. 10 years of blocking knife thrusts and the pick handles of sadistic pigs. The fact that the author of this book lived with his death for so many years gives his book a special kind of importance. But it would be a mistake to consider it simply as the work of an individual. George always refused to consider himself an individual. Untold thousands, both inside and outside prison, joined in its proclamation of total revolutionary war. This book was written literally in bedlam, with the author locked in solitary for a minimum of 23 and a half hours a day, in the midst of a raucous screaming that never stopped. The screams of prisoners being beaten, the screams of men retreating from intolerable pain into madness. It is a book about taking the revolution that George worked and died for inside prison out into society at large. His message to his revolutionary brothers is crystal clear. Settle your quarrels. Come together. Understand the reality of our situation. Understand that fascism is already here. That people are already dying who could be saved. That generations more will die or live poor, butchered half-lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done. Discover your humanity and your love in revolution. Pass on the torch. Join us. Give up your life for the people. George Jackson was shot and killed inside San Quentin on August 21st, 1971. The convicts who were with him inside the cell block where he was being confined have asserted that he sacrificed his own life to save them from an official massacre. This would only have been in keeping with the character of his entire life. Gregory Armstrong, October 15, 1971. And that statement from those inmates was from an affidavit filed by the inmates of the San Quentin Adjustment Center shortly after the author's death. Strong preface. The preface made it very clear that a call to action and to revolutionary action specifically is the only thing that can make a person's life worth living, as long as we have to live under the system that we live under. Jonathan Jackson was 17 when they mowed him down, and he had already concluded that his freedom could only be won at the point of an assault rifle. We live in conditions where at this point, failing to act is a failure to act in self-defense, because at this point, you are under attack, I'm under attack, we're under attack, comrades, and we gotta proceed as if have a right to defend ourselves. Uh, Otherwise, these fucking fascists, they will kill us all. So, very, very strong preface. So this isn't hugely important, but how did Jackson get the materials to read and write? Well, George Jackson was a Panther. He was an official member of the Black Panther parties even while he was on the inside. So I imagine that, because the Panthers themselves had quite a lumping background themselves. So I imagine that he had a network of people that he could use to like get those resources to him even while he was locked up in solitary confinement. Huey, I know Huey himself would visit Dr. Jackson too. So it's pretty likely that Huey and other Panthers would like get him those materials as well as his mother, as well as his mother. So what they gonna do? Deny some people a pencil and paper? I mean, probably, honestly. But, hell, I think they had mentioned in here how he was writing. Let's see. In the preface, they mentioned how he was writing. Got it. I think they had mentioned something about a typewriter or some kind of machine that he was using to write or something along those lines. But yeah, he had a network of people who could help him with something along those lines. And he had to write, and as a prisoner at that time, you still had the right to write letters. So it's possible that he would just request to write a letter and then get into the business of writing when he was writing for Revolution instead, under the guise that he was simply writing letters. Because you're supposed to have some rights even in this filthy fucking country. Yeah, that's a good question, Sudawoodle. I appreciate you for asking that. Yeah, he was definitely a Panther. He was definitely a Panther. Blood in my eye. We must accept the eventuality of bringing the USA to its knees. Accepting the closing off of critical sections of the city with barbed wire, armored pit carriers crisscrossing the streets, soldiers everywhere, Tommy guns pointed at stomach level, curling black against the daylight sky. The smell of cordite, house-to-house searches, doors being kicked in, the commonness of death. So if you're just joining us, we've just wrapped up the preface. We are now proceeding to page 3, where the book officially begins, if you want to take a second to join us. Alright, cool. Before I go on reading, anybody want to volunteer to do a few pages of reading? Not an issue at all. I'll take it. Alright. Letter to a Comrade. March 28th, 1971. A prison comrade of the authors who must remain anonymous. My sister has informed me of your release and the political education class you have formed. From her words and your messages, I sense that we are still together. We've gone through approximately the same changes since they separated us. The confused flight to a national revolutionary Africa through the riot stage of revolutionary Black America. We have finally arrived at scientific revolutionary socialism for the rest of the colonial world. I was hoping that you wouldn't get trapped in the riot stage like a great many other very sincere brothers. I have to browbeat them every day down here. They think they don't need ideology, strategy, or tactics. They think being a warrior is quite enough. And yet, without discipline or direction, they'll end up washing cars or unclaimed bodies in the city-state's morgue. But I was almost certain that wouldn't be your destination, brother. Though I no longer adhere to all of Nakiev's revolutionary catechism, too cold, very much like the fascist psychology. Revolution should be love inspired. Amen to that. His first line contains the incontrovertible truth. Incontrovertible truth. The black revolutionary is twice doomed. And Nikiev was an early Russian nihilist. His catechism can be found in Zero, The Story of Terrorism by Robert Payne. So at times I wonder about the present state of revolutionary black consciousness. It's really annoying to hear blacks express right-wing traditionalist political ideals. I mean, the same spiel that you get from Wallace, Maddox, Hearst, or Hunt coming from black people like Lomax, Young, and Bunch. Some recently dead now, thanks to the forces of good. I think Lady Lomax is still around, though, representing Africa with her Anglo-Saxon vernacular. Her husband, L. Lomax, was CIA. Did you read The Reluctant African, which was sheer propaganda for the owner, disguised in blackface? These are the really dangerous people. When we leap to destroy the owner, we'll have these kind of niggers to fight. They will use the tactic white left-wing causes to protect their bosses. White right-wing cause. You must teach that socialism, communalism is man, that its principles formed the basis of mostly all the East African cultures. There was no word to denote possession in the original East African tongues. The only independent African societies today are socialistic. Those which allowed capitalism to remain are still neo-colonies. Any black who would defend an African military dictatorship is as much a fascist as who. Are you aware of how the people are living under these so-called Africanized fascist cultures? The Congo and the entire west coast of Africa, excepting Guinea and Mauritania, are still slave states, dominated by Western black right-wing puppets. I'm thoroughly sick of the old just be simples, young ones too. They'll be your main source of opposition in communizing the black colonies. The good white people who own things will always give them a few inches in their papers or other media. That's how fascism works, influencing the masses and institutions through elites. This was released in, I think, 1970. This book was 1971, so shortly before his death. And even back then, and probably even before his time, they was already like pushing back against this idea that our cause is somehow against human nature, that socialism is against human nature. The human nature argument is such a disingenuous, ahistorical analysis of what's possible that it doesn't even, like, it's not worth entertaining. You know, we've had communalism before. We haven't had any of us with as communism, of course, but the idea that we can't be a communal people and cooperate is you would have to have not studied human history to be that. It doesn't actually make any sense when people say shit like that. So with George to bring up, like, yeah, like, okay, well, I guess you could say that only if you want to say fuck all of like East Africa's like history. Like, yeah, he's spot on to bring up that point, you know, so that's good shit. So moving on, I talked to several black lawyers when I got this last case of pig killing hung on me. We start off agreeing, but they abandoned me the moment I attacked Anglo-Saxon law, capitalism and the blues, and then went on to recognize Black Panthers, Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Nyerere, and Odinga instead of Kenyatta, Lumumba instead of that little punk in Ethiopia, and Peking instead of Atlanta or Freetown. That will be your main source of opposition, the black running dog. But it's unfair to automatically condemn a black person for not understanding economic and political subtleties. Some are simply confused in an honest way. Some of the arguments they pose will center around the dependent cliche that Africa will invent something unique. It won't be socialism, communalism, or communism, or capitalism. Often they'll leave out the denunciation of capitalism altogether. You must explain the economic motive of in social history and bring out that there are only two ways by which societies can ever be governed and organized for production of their needs. The various types of totalitarian methods represented by assorted capitalist and fascist arrangements and the egalitarian method. Egalitarianism is people's government, and people's government in economics is socialism, dialectical and materialist. How else can societies be governed? There must be hierarchies or the elimination of hierarchies. Then show that the greatest contributions to egalitarianism came from Africa, the greatest and the first examples. That's such an important point for him to bring up here. He's bringing up this idea. You do get a lot of people, among my people for sure, who, they can obviously see that capitalism doesn't work for our people. They're still buying into like Red Scare propaganda and the shit that they heard about. So they'll just, without too much critical thought into it, just dismiss communism and socialism as like what works for our people. And they'll say shit like, oh, we need something different. We don't need capitalism or communism. We just need, to build, an alternative to like what hasn't worked and all this shit. But like that seems to be an honest analysis when you consider it on its head. But when you really pull the veil back, you start to be like, okay, well, man, that's not really. There's not a real analysis being placed there. There's just a correct analysis of capitalism not working and an unfactual analysis of socialism somehow being detrimental to our people, as if what was happening for our people before the rise of colonialism somehow wasn't working. But of course, we're not in the business of ignoring, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of history before colonialism, or even thousands, really. Then showed that the greatest contributions to egalitarianism came from Africa, the greatest and the first examples. Then, comrade, you would encounter the faint-hearted and illogical types like Ali, Clay, entertainer and tool of the capitalist cliques. Their line is, ain't nobody but black folks gonna die in a revolution. The argument completely overlooks the fact that we always have done most of the dying, and still do. Dying at the stake through social neglect or in U.S. foreign wars. The point is now to construct a situation where somewhere else will join in the dying. If it fails and we have to do most of the dying anyway, we're certainly no worse off than before. Amen to that. Mashallah. We found ourselves today forced into a re-examination of the whole nature of black revolutionary consciousness and its relative standing within a class society steeped in a form of racism, so sensitized that it extends itself even to the slightest variation in skin tone. The great majority of blacks reject racism. They have never found it expedient, wise, or honorable to take on the characteristics of the enemy. I think it is vitally important to stress that for blacks, a concern for the survival of the race is not patently not definable as racism. Yeah, that's a very important distinction to make. We're trying to survive. They're trying to wipe us out. It's not the same shit. Black power and white power could never be equal, of course. Any explanation for social phenomena, past, present, or future, must present valid arguments and proof. As we travel back into history, honest descriptions and definitions will inevitably overlap. Sounds good, Suluwu, though. I might take you up on that shortly. As we travel back into history, honest descriptions and definitions will inevitably overlap. They will differ depending on their geopolitical standpoint. Ideally, they should be colored with as little subjective interpretation as possible from today's world. The present, due to its staggering complexities, is almost as conjectural as the past. We must prove our predictions about the future with action. So all my comments must be considered the merest supposition. They must be considered in just the same way we must consider all the other comments in this area. They merit attention only in that as soon as I make them, it won't be much longer before I go about proving them. As a slave, the social phenomenon that engages my whole consciousness is, of course, revolution. The slave and revolution. Born to a premature death, a menial, subsistence wage, worker, odd job man, the cleaner, the caught, the man under hatches, without bail. That's me, the colonial victim. Anyone who can pass the civil service examination today can kill me tomorrow. Anyone who passed the civil service examination yesterday can kill me today with complete immunity. I've lived with repression every moment of my life. A repression so formidable that any movement on my part can only bring relief, the respite of a small victory or the release of death. In every sense of the term, in every sense that's real, I'm a slave to and of property. Okay. You want to take over for a few pages, Sudawula?
Sure. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, you can just let me know whenever you're ready. And yeah.
I'm good to go.
Revolution within a modern industrial capitalist society can only mean the overthrow of all existing property relations and the destruction of all institutions that directly or indirectly support existing property relations. It must include the total suppression of all classes and individuals who endorse the present state of property relations, or who stand to gain from it. Anything less than this is reform. Government and the infrastructure of the enemy capitalist state must be destroyed to get at the heart of the problem, property relations. Otherwise, there is no revolution. Reshuffle the governmental personnel and forms without changing property relations and economic institutions, and you have produced simply another reform stage in the old bourgeois revolution. The power to alter the present imbalances, to remedy the critical defects of an advanced industrial state ordered on an antiquated set of greed-confused motives, rests with control over production and the distribution of wealth. If the 1% who presently control the wealth of the society maintain their control after any reordering of the state, the changes cannot be said to be revolutionary.
You want to read for a little bit, artist?
Sure. The prerequisite for a successful popular revolution is that the victors totally junk the old machinery of state. Lenin stressed in The State and Revolution, one thing especially was proven by the Commune viz?
Yeah.
That the working class, what is that?
I'll look it up while you're continuing.
Thank you. That the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. And again, the working class must break up, smash the ready-made state machinery, and not confine itself merely to laying hold of it.
It means namely, or in other words.
Oh, okay. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
The reason is simple enough. A popular revolution means a revolution by and for the popular classes. Its ultimate aim is to bring all classes into one, that is, destroy the class state.
Amen. Revolutionary change means the seizure of all and the transference of these holdings into the remaining 99%. If the 1% are simply displaced by another 1%, revolutionary change is not taking place. A social revolution after the fact of the modern corporate capitalist state can only mean the breakup of that state in a completely new form of economics and culture. As slaves, we understand that ownership and the mechanics of distribution must be reversed. The problems of the black colony and the brown colony and those of the entire 99% who are being manipulated can never be redressed as long as the necessary resources for their solution are the personal property of an extraneous minority motivated solely for its own survival. And that extraneous minority will never consider the proper solution. We have this on record from a voice speaking from inside the Fourth Reich, a lieutenant governor of California orating in public on poverty. Quote, 1/3 of the population will always be ill-housed, ill-clothed, and ill-fed. Many urban problems are really conditions that we cannot change or do not want to incur the disadvantages of changing. His 1/3 statement was a calculated understatement. So I want to go back to something he just said here too, because it's very important. He says, quote, revolutionary change means the seizure of all that is held by the 1% and the transference of these holdings into 99%. If the 1% are simply displaced by another 1%, revolutionary change is not taking place, close quote. This is why it's important in my understanding of Marxist theory, or just dialectics in general, to like take a look at some of the framings of some of these historical events, and I'm mostly referring to the American Revolution in this case, revolution, and to look and to kind of reanalyze, say, well, this was definitely like a bourgeois struggle waged against the state, but they weren't looking to do anything other than establish a state where they could be free to go engage bourgeois politics elsewhere. And that's what the revolution ended up in. It wasn't anything that fundamentally upended the social order and was fundamentally different from what it was looking to break away from. It was looking to continue the logic of the evolution of feudalism into capitalism, but under its own bourgeois management. And so you can't call that, it kind of seems silly to call that a revolution. Nothing fundamentally changed for the masses. It doesn't read. If anything, the establishment of the American colony was a disaster for the masses. It delayed progress. It didn't accelerate progress. Not from the perspective of a colonized person. Interested in y'all's opinions on it. I want to share it in the chat. So, to the slave, revolution is an imperative, a love-inspired, conscious act of desperation. I guess the question I'm asking is, do y'all consider the American Revolution to be revolutionary? Even really a revolution as opposed to something cool? I guess that's a good way to frame the question. Anyways, to the slave, revolution is a love-inspired, conscious act of desperation. It's aggressive. It isn't cool or cautious. It's bold, audacious, violent expression of icy, distasteful hatred. It can hardly be any other way without raising a fundamental contradiction. If revolution, and especially revolution, is anything less than an effective defense, attack weapon, and a charger for the people to mount now, it is meaningful to the great majority of the slaves. If revolution is tied to dependence on the inscrutabilities of long-range politics, it cannot be made relevant to the person who expects to die tomorrow. There can be no rigid time controls attached to the process. That offers itself as relief, not if those for whom it is principally intended are under attack now. If the proponents of revolution can learn to distinguish and translate the theoretical practical, if they continue to debate just how to call up and harness the conscious motive forces of revolution, the revolutionary ideal will be the loser. It will be rejected. The principal reservoir of revolutionary potential in America lies in the black colony. Its sheer numerical strength, its desperate historical relation to the violence of the productive, and the fact of its present status in the creation of wealth force, the black stratum at the base of the whole class structure into the forefront of any revolutionary scheme. 30% of all industrial black. Close to 40% of all industrial filled by black. Blacks are still doing the work of the greatest slave state in history. The terms of our servitude are all that have been. Sudowoodo says, been meaning to read Gerald Counter-Revolution of 1776, as I assume that goes into what you're talking about. Yeah, when you give that a read, definitely let us know what your findings end up being. Or report to us on Horn's findings. Curious. The black colony can and will influence the fate of things to come into the USA. The impact of black revolutionary rage actually could carry at least the opening stages of a socialist revolution under certain circumstances, not discounting some of the complexities created by the spectrum of racism. However, if we are ever going to be successful in tying black energy and rage to the international socialist revolution, we must understand that racial complexities exist. When the Minister of Defense and Servant of the People, Huey P. Newton, attacks the strategy of the American Communist Party and the liberal left revisionists for their failure to devise a policy which takes into account the special circumstances of Yankee-style racism, he is not attacking communism as a collective ideal. He is questioning the Communist Party and other less committed sections of the left revolutionary movement about their awareness of the unique problems presented by a particularly vicious and immediately threatening racism. My brother Jonathan, a communist revolutionary to the core, writing me in June of 1969, theorized as follows. We are quite obviously faced with a need to organize some small defenses to the more flagrant abuses of the system now. I mean this in the military sense. The period of disorganized activity, riots and rallies, and purely political agitation and education has come to a close. The violence of the opposition has brought it to an end. We cannot raise consciousness another millimeter without a new set of tactics. Long-range political ploys alone are not practical for us. To me, the concept seems to assume that someday in the distant future we'll produce a 700-pound flea to fight the paper tiger. That's not too likely to happen. While we await the precise moment when all capitalism's victims indignantly rise to destroy the system, we are being devoured in family lots at the whim of this thing. There will be no super slave. Some of us are going to have to take our courage in hand and build a hard revolutionary cadre for selective retaliatory violence. We have numbers on our side if the whites who support revolutionary change can prevent this thing from degenerating into race war. The picture of the US as a paper tiger is quite accurate, but there is a great deal of work to be done on its destruction, and I'm of the opinion that if there is a big job of growing to do, the sooner begun, the sooner done. Both Huey and Jonathan are understandably calling for the programmed revolution to take into account the fact of racial genocide. Jonathan is calling from his grave, adding another voice to the many thunderous graveyard affirmations which, for us blacks, speeds the revolution to its ultimate issue. In order to develop revolutionary consciousness, we must learn how revolutionary consciousness can be raised to the highest point by stimuli from the vanguard elements. We recognize and appreciate the decades of hard, sometimes dangerous work done in the name of revolution by the older socialist parties. Perhaps we wouldn't exist at all were it not for their efforts. It is our sincere wish to operate in complete harmony with these older groups. But we must create new impetus and greater intellectual and physical energy if the forces of reaction are not to win another extended reprieve. A joint effort will make the task of overwhelming our common enemy all the simpler. That is a fact. We've got to come together in solidarity. But if our present differences cannot be reconciled by an honest and fearless search for the correct way, then we will be forced to take the foundation of correct ideals and theory into our own hands and build a positive and more practical superstructure applicable to the circumstances surrounding our lives. In his guerrilla warfare, Lenin wrote, quote, "New forms of struggle, unknown to the participants of the given period, inevitably arise as the given social situation changes. The coming crisis will introduce new forms of struggle that we are now unable to foresee," and that's from Lenin and Guerrilla Warfare. In other words, the old guard must not fail to understand that circumstances change in time and space, that there can be nothing dogmatic about revolutionary theory. It is to be born out of each popular struggle. Each popular struggle must be analyzed historically to discover new ideas. In the words of John Garassi, building from one to the other, eventually the revolutionary cadre would become equipped with a theory rooted in experience brought in by historical knowledge, tested by combat, and fortified by reflection. After 10 or 15 generations of laboring on a subsistence level, after 140 years of political agitation and education, we grow impatient. Not that we fail to understand the risk and complexities of anti-establishment warfare, we simply want to live. We question a strategy that seems to have stopped short of providing a tactic for growth and for survival. Terror tactics like lynching will never be allowed to work on us. If terror is going to be the choice of weapons, there must be funerals on both sides. And let the whole enemy power complex be conscious of that. The superstructure of any edifice that is as extensive and as lofty as revolution must be re-examined with each successive layer for faults for possible improvement of method. We have the foundation of our strategy. We have studied Marx and Lenin for a description and history of the modern industrial state. We organized our thoughts and trained our bodies for the ordeal of grave digging. Our vanguard elements understand the simple importance of winning consciousness. Of course, education and familiarization with the core issues on a broad basis precede hard revolutionary violence. Okay. If people are to understand and relate to revolutionary violence, they must first be educated into an acceptance of the fact that there is no alternative, or that the alternative is less inviting than a fight. Our whole question is just what level of consciousness will support the violent revolutionary activity necessary to achieve our ends? And how will we reach when this level is reached? And how will we know when this level is reached? Recall, our Mao teaches us that, Our Mao teaches us that when revolution fails, it isn't the fault of the people. It is the fault of the vanguard party. The people will never come to us and say, let's fight. There have never been any spontaneous revolutions. They were all staged, manufactured by people who went to the head of the masses and directed them. The liberalist slogan, you can't get ahead of the people, is meaningless. From what other position can one lead? From the rear? Rear guard leadership? A typical Yankee innovation. I think most of these irresponsible excuse slogans are based on dread, a secret wish to avoid the discomfiture of people's war. In all the successful class struggles and colonial wars of liberation, the vanguard elements did get ahead of the people in pool. There is no other way in forward mass movement. A vanguard which fears that consciousness will outstrip spontaneity, which fears to put forth a bold plan that would compel general recognition even among those who differ from us. Are they not confusing vanguard with rearguard? I am not implying that the vanguard party act out the people's role. I am not implying a society superior to society. We must never forget that it is the people who change circumstances and that the educator himself needs educating. Going among the people, learning from the people, and serving the people is really stating that we must find out exactly what the people need and organize them around those needs, or these needs rather. If the statement implies a coming from somewhere else, it substantiates no superiority but rather a biological existential reality. This concept needs very little substantiating beyond the obvious fact of a nation of slaves who control no more wealth than some clothes, perhaps a worthless automobile, and a roof of sorts over their heads, but who have been successfully conditioned to feel rich or at least contented. The task of a revolutionary is to make revolution. The word manufacture can be substituted for the word make, and the meaning comes through a little better for us. I'm thinking we're going to read to... What's a good stopping point? We're going to read to the bottom of page 22, and then, or the top of page 22, and then stop there. So, recall, we had people who felt conditions weren't right in the 1930s also. The government's bread lines were backed up around every corner, and baseball was at its peak. Private ownership of public property should have been destroyed in that decade, but the conditions weren't right. The vanguard elements betrayed the people of this nation and the world as a result of their failure to seize the time. The consequences were a catastrophic war and a new round of imperialist expansion. This time carried out by the greatest imperialist of all time, the Yankee Brigade. There would be no Indochina situation, to mention one of dozens of like situations, if we had taken ourselves seriously then, and all conditions were favorable. It was a slightly below conscious desire to avoid doing the U.S. further violence, and perhaps a general distaste for organized violence in particular, that robbed us of our chance to win on that occasion when, ironically, a win would have cost very little. There wasn't even the illusion of well-being. In a report by Comrade Jonathan Jackson in November of 1969, just before Fred Hampton and Mark Clark's murders in Chicago and the shootout at the Central Avenue Panther headquarters in LA, he says, "It's come down on us hard now. There are 20 different breeds of pigs patrolling every street in the colony here. I mean, every section of the city that can be said to be predominantly black is saturated with the establishment's demented gunslingers of every sort. They're all nervous and dangerous as king cobras, spies, double agents, entrapment, a war of electronics, house-to-house searches, doors being kicked in. I feel just as you do on these issues. I'm not going for it, even if it means fighting them by myself. If they kick down the door of a house, I'll stop that. They'll fall in dead. The 9mm Browning weighs something like 2 pounds. I'm not carrying this extra weight around my belt for nothing. It has a 13-round clip. I keep one in the barrel, 14 shots. Save me a cell on Murderer's Row there. I could have 14 murder charges any day now." And so back on 17, they're explaining to us about a shootout at the Central Avenue Panther headquarters in LA. 2 Black Panther Party leaders killed during a raid by the Chicago police. Hampton was the chairman of the Illinois branch of the party. A special report prepared by the Commission of Inquiry headed by Ramsey Clark concluded that the purpose of the police raid was to quote-unquote search and destroy. It also concluded that Hampton had been deliberately killed by shots fired at close range while he was totally unconscious. The shootout on Central was the result of a police raid on the LA Panther headquarters. The Panthers battled the police for 5 hours, at times even throwing the police's own tear gas canisters back at them. Fucking pigs. God damn it. Actually, yeah, we'll still read till 22. Try to get the picture down. Try to get the picture. Down every through street, they cruise just a few moments apart at most. Sometimes the stupid bastards are bumper to bumper. Each one of the cruisers has a different residential street here in the black communities that seems to belong to them. It's patterned. Let's say 2 pig cars, P1 and P2, are both traveling south on Central. They'll patrol 6 to 7 blocks on the main street. P1 will then make a left on 50th Street, P2 will right on 51st Street, etc. It works out so that each couple of square blocks is in effect always surrounded, cut off, divided, subdivided. Repression is here. I followed them, studied them, hold a few of their cars. You should see how they'll run when they can't tell from exactly what quarter they're drawing fire. We overestimate them. Or perhaps we have little sense of our own power. In the short run, and here, I mean in an isolated tactical operation sitting within a particular design with military weapons, we could easily outgun the establishment's first line of defense. What, for example, would the city pigs do if they are confronted by a 38 snubbed revolver in the hand of a brother who's fired that 38 perhaps 10 times in his life? Then take the situation but give the brother a flamethrower, stolen from the military. Give the brother an armored van from inside which he could use said flamethrower. Give him also 2 comrades in arms, one equipped with an M60 machine gun, the other an anti-tank rocket launcher. Pigs are punks. Give me 10 cells armed, as I've just mentioned, and we can start to enforce some of the demands of the people. Their present show of strength is actually their weakness. They're too visible. Comrades ask me sometimes what we can do against all these pigs. I state it simply. We put them to death. They look at me as if to say, "You're nuts, man." When I go about my explanation, their eyes go blank, or they are distracted by something fly blocks down the street. They're not hearing then. So what's happening? The things I say, for us, smile, seems too fantastic for them to even listen. Then it doesn't seem fantastic for them to, Yet it doesn't seem fantastic for them to go against the LAPD with a snub-nosed revolver. There's a great deal of work to be done with ourselves yet, but the day of the real dragon is coming. Long live the gorilla. Jonathan was 16 years old then, and he had just had that year, and he had just that year been allowed to drive a car. He liked to drive and observe. He had long since learned to like to fight. Guns and weapons in general were his forte. I carefully reminded him that even vanguard violence was organized violence. He returned one of Fanon's lines. It's time for the talking to end and the acting to begin. In another of his reports, after the Chicago murders of Hampton and Clark and the 5-hour shootout at Black Panther headquarters in LA, he writes, "The fact of American terror, slave existence in general, seems to have almost destroyed the nervous system of the black man here. They are frightened and feel they are smart for being so. Those that were unaffected, those that escaped, those that refused to be intimidated, dismayed, prudent to the point of cowardice, have either joined or supported the Black Panther Party. They got down pretty cold. One point needs to be cleared up, however. I recall you remarking that in an urban guerrilla situation, the military proper must be hidden, separate from the political front, since unlike a classical Mao Gyap countryside struggle where the enemy's principal forces are 30 miles down the road, with us the enemy is all around, within a few moments of strike. There should, I feel, be one branch that is purely political, operating the rent strikes, the breakfast programs, the people's bazaars, where all sorts of food and clothing, utensils and tools are sold, hospitals or clinics, free of course, and what I will term cottage shops to employ those who will work for the new medium of exchange, love and loyalty. As such things as the making of the clothing and canning of the food for the people's bazaar. Then there should be the super secret branch to enforce. The military, the comrades with the nervous equipment to make the best use of the M60, the M16, the flamethrower, the hand grenade, the mortar, our armored vans and equipment in front and plenty of gun ports, bulletproof tires, etc. You dig? One of the large trucks properly prepared, plastic may be the best armor. 1.5 inches will stop a 220 grain slug fired from a 45 submachine gun. 2 inches to 3 inches will protect you from high-powered rifle. And with the heavy armored piercing ammo equipment, M60 port in the front cab pointing in the direction that the truck is along the street. It's more effective than a tank of the Yankee style. The machine gun in the front cab and one pointing out to the rear from the trailer has whatever street they are moving down in a guerrilla ambush tactic we'll call angulation. Each one of these guns point in front and back up the street and back down. It has the advantage of being able to rack that entire street with only a slight back and forth lateral movement. One armor-piercing bullet may render several of the unrighteous dead. And comrade, the pigs are so proud of their new little copters, they're suckers. It's almost comical to hear them boast and watch them look to the sky with the pride of power. The pig who will get up in one of those things is as stupidly suicidal as a duck trying to outfly a charge of 12-gauge shot. The fierce and beautiful Kongs shoot down a couple dozen of the very biggest and best copters Yankee invention can produce every week. These things that the pigs use are toys. Sitting ducks. One solid or armor piercing, 30 caliber bullet aimed at any one of the several points. The tail rotor, the hub of the main rotor, or even the operator will reduce $200,000 worth of Yankee invention to scrap. I was pursuing this joke of a secondary education when the whole thing occurred, but acting with my small thing would have hardly helped much, though it may have helped raise consciousness some. The procedures attacked from the rear, the idea of it, strong. Militarily, it would have been demonstrated to the pigs that the Panther Party is not out there on the limb alone. And of course, it would have promoted among the people that confidence of ability we always speak on when together. How would they have felt, the pigs and the people, if the nameless, faceless, lightning swift soldier of the people could have reached up twisted the tail of their $200,000 death bird and hurled it into the streets, broken, ablaze. I think that sort of thing has come to do, has more to do with consciousness than anything else I can think. Long live the Panther. Power to the people who don't fear freedom. Jonathan was 16 years old then, I repeat. I think that's a powerful place to stop, y'all. Man, Jonathan Jackson's words always get me fired. Reading Jonathan makes Shaw feel, but he be having me feel some kind of way. You know, just in like the simple analysis of like what can be done just to have a starting point is enough to make you feel like you're not doing enough getting shit done. Did get you fired up and ready to go? Get you fired up and ready to go. All right, y'all. So we're gonna make Mondays in this part of the afternoon, and it kind of depends on when I get home from work those days. Our new regular reading. This is what's gonna work for me, and it seems we got 1, 2, 3, 4 people besides me in here. That's enough for me to want to go ahead and do the reading. So next week I'm looking to get it in at 3, and if something should change, I'll let y'all know, but I'm tired of having to skip readings for different reasons, so I'm ready to get back to this shit. And so yeah, thank y'all for being here. As always, y'all know I love y'all. Solidarity always. I'll spend some time with y'all next week. Until then, y'all take care of y'all.